Sarah Martinez had always believed that heroes were made in movies, not in the sterile halls of community hospitals during quiet night shifts. She was wrong. Sometimes heroism arrives disguised as a routine Tuesday evening, wrapped in the sound of rain against windows and the steady beeping of heart monitors. Sometimes it comes when you're checking on an elderly patient who reminds you of your grandmother, or when a nervous security guard asks if you've heard the weather warnings. Sometimes heroism doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers through flooded hallways and broken generators, asking only one question. What would you do when everything falls apart?
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the normally peaceful town of Millfield, Colorado, into something that resembled a waterlogged painting. Sarah Martinez could hear it drumming against the windows of St. Mary's Community Hospital as she began her night shift, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over the past 72 hours. Sarah preferred the night shift for reasons she could never fully explain to her day shift colleagues. There was something almost sacred about the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the hospital's usual chaos settled into a more manageable rhythm. The visitors went home, the administrators locked their offices, and the building seemed to exhale, leaving behind only the essential sounds of life being preserved, the whisper of ventilators, the gentle beeping of monitors, and the soft-soled footsteps of nurses making their rounds. At 34, Sarah had been working at St. Mary's for 8 years, ever since she graduated from nursing school at the University of Colorado, Denver, and decided that small-town medicine suited her better than the frantic pace of big city hospitals. Millfield had a population of just over 12,000 people, most of whom had lived there for decades, creating the kind of community where the nurses knew not just their patients' medical histories, but their family stories, their fears, and their hopes. Tonight, Sarah was responsible for the ICU ward, which housed 8 patients in various stages of critical care. The unit was located on the second floor of the hospital in the newer wing that had been added in the 1990s when the community had still believed it was growing. Now, 2 decades later, Millfield was more of a way station than a destination, a place where people came to stabilize before being transferred to larger medical facilities in Denver or Colorado Springs. Sarah's first stop was always room 237, where Eleanor Chen had been residing for the past 2 weeks. Mrs. Chen was 67 years old, with silver hair that she kept meticulously arranged despite her illness, and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that made Sarah suspect there was more to this woman's story than her medical chart revealed. She'd been admitted with complications from a cardiac condition that had been slowly deteriorating for months, but there was something about her that reminded Sarah of her own grandmother, a strength that transcended physical frailty. Mrs. Chen's family lived in California, too far away for daily visits, but they called every evening at precisely 7 o'clock to check in on her progress. Sarah had often been the one to answer these calls, providing updates and reassurance to voices that carried the weight of love and distance in equal measure. There was a daughter named Linda who worked as a teacher in San Francisco, a son named David who managed a restaurant in Los Angeles, and several grandchildren whose names Mrs. Chen would recite like a prayer when the pain medication made her drowsy. As Sarah entered the room, she found Mrs. Chen awake, staring out the window at the rain-soaked parking lot below. The elderly woman turned and smiled, the same gentle expression she offered every night, regardless of her pain levels or medical concerns. "Good evening, Sarah," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested English was not her first language, though she spoke it with perfect grammar and careful pronunciation. "How has your day been?" This was typical of Mrs. Chen, always asking about others before acknowledging her own needs. Sarah had learned that the elderly woman had immigrated to the United States from Taiwan in 1960, when she was just 23 years old. She had built a life in Colorado, working in various technical fields before retiring 15 years ago. Her medical chart listed her previous occupation simply as engineer, But Sarah suspected that description barely scratched the surface of what Mrs. Chen had accomplished during her working years. "My day was fine, thank you for asking," Sarah replied, checking the monitors that tracked Mrs. Chen's vital signs. Her heart rate was steady but weak, and her oxygen levels required constant monitoring. The cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, had been cautiously optimistic about Mrs. Chen's recovery prospects. But at her age, with her condition, every day was a victory worth celebrating. "The rain is getting worse," Mrs. Chen observed, nodding toward the window. "I've been watching the parking lot fill up with water all evening." Sarah glanced outside and saw that Mrs. Chen was right. The hospital's parking lot, which normally drained efficiently during Colorado's frequent but brief thunderstorms, was beginning to resemble a shallow lake. Cars sat in water that reached halfway up their tires, and she could see maintenance staff placing sandbags around the building's entrances. "Have you lived in Millfield long enough to remember the last big flood?" Sarah asked as she adjusted Mrs. Chen's blanket and checked her IV lines. Mrs. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "I remember the flood of 1985 and the one in 2013, but this rain feels different somehow, more persistent." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure what Mrs. Chen meant by different. Rain was rain and flooding was flooding. The town had weathered severe storms before, and the flood barriers installed along the Clearwater River 5 years ago were supposed to prevent any serious damage to the downtown area where the hospital was located. As Sarah completed her assessment of Mrs. Chen's condition, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. A moment later, Jake Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, looking slightly uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether he should interrupt. Jake was the hospital's night security guard, a position he had held for only 3 months. At 28, he was younger than most of the other staff members, and Sarah could see that he was still adjusting to the unique rhythms of hospital work. Security at a medical facility was different than other security jobs, less about preventing crime and more about providing a reassuring presence during the vulnerable overnight hours when patients often felt most isolated and afraid. Sarah had made an effort to get to know Jake during his first weeks on the job, partly because she believed in welcoming new team members, but also because she had noticed something in his demeanor that suggested he was dealing with challenges beyond the normal adjustment period of a new job. He was competent and hardworking, but there was a carefulness to his movements, a hypervigilance that spoke of someone who had learned to watch for danger in places where others felt safe. "Evening, Jake," Sarah said warmly. "How are things tonight?" "Quiet so far," Jake replied, though his eyes kept drifting toward the window where the rain continued its relentless assault. "But I've been monitoring the weather reports, and they're saying this storm system is more severe than initially predicted. The National Weather Service updated their flood warnings about an hour ago." Mrs. Chen turned her attention to Jake with the kind of focused interest she usually reserved for conversations with her doctors. "What exactly are they predicting?" Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a gesture that Sarah had learned indicated he was choosing his words carefully. "They're saying the Clearwater River is rising faster than expected. The flood barriers are holding so far, but if the rain continues at this intensity for any longer—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in Millfield understood the geography of their town. The Clearwater River ran directly through the center of the community, and while it was usually a peaceful waterway that added charm to the downtown area, it could become dangerous during heavy rains. The hospital was located less than half a mile from the river, in what emergency planners designated as Zone 2 of the floodplain.
Sarah had lived through the 2013 flood when she had been working at the hospital for 5 years. She remembered the anxiety of watching water creep closer to the building, the carefully controlled evacuation procedures, and the relief when the rain finally stopped and the water began to recede. But that flood had lasted only 18 hours from beginning to end. This storm had already been going for 3 times that long. "The barriers held during the last big storm," Sarah said, repeating the reassurance she had been giving herself all evening. "I'm sure they'll hold now." But even as she spoke, Sarah felt a small knot of unease forming in her stomach. There was something about this rain that felt different from the storm she had experienced before. It wasn't just the duration, it was the intensity, the way it seemed to be driven by a determination that transcended normal weather patterns. She had learned to trust her instincts during her 8 years as a nurse, and her instincts were telling her that this night might not be as routine as she had hoped. Jake seemed to sense her uncertainty. "I'm going to do another perimeter check," he said, "just to make sure all the exterior doors are secure and the drainage systems are working properly." After Jake left, Sarah continued her rounds through the ICU. Besides Mrs. Chen, the ward held 7 other patients, each requiring different levels of care and monitoring. There was Mr. Patterson, a 63-year-old farmer who was recovering from triple bypass surgery and spent most of his time worrying about who was taking care of his cattle. Miss Williams, a 45-year-old diabetic whose blood sugar levels had been dangerously unstable for the past week, requiring constant adjustments to her medication regimen. In room 233, Tommy Valdez, a 19-year-old construction worker, was recovering from injuries sustained in a job site accident. He had been unconscious for the first week of his stay, but had awakened 3 days ago with his memory intact and his spirit remarkably unbroken, despite the fact that his recovery would require months of physical therapy. Room 239 housed Margaret Foster, an 82-year-old retired teacher who had developed pneumonia that had progressed into respiratory failure. She was connected to a ventilator and required round-the-clock monitoring, but her vital signs have been gradually improving over the past few days. Each of these patients represented not just a medical case, but a life story that had intersected with the hospital at a moment of crisis. Sarah had learned their histories not from charts, but from conversations with family members, from overheard phone calls, and from the small personal details that accumulated during long nights of medical care. As she moved from room to room, checking monitors, adjusting medications, and providing the kind of comfort that could only be offered by human presence, Sarah reflected on why she had chosen nursing as a profession. It wasn't just about medical knowledge or technical skills, though those were important. It was about being present during the moments when people were most vulnerable, offering competence and compassion in equal measure. The rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, and Sarah found herself checking the weather reports on her phone with increasing frequency. The National Weather Service had upgraded their flood warning to a flash flood watch, indicating that conditions were deteriorating more rapidly than initially anticipated. The Clearwater River was now at its highest level in over a decade, and while the flood barriers were still holding, engineers were monitoring them constantly for signs of stress. At 1:30 a.m., Sarah was in the medication room preparing the next round of treatments for her patients when she heard a sound that made her pause. It was a low rumbling, distant at first, but growing steadily louder. She initially dismissed it as thunder, but as the sound continued, she realized it was something else entirely. The rumbling was coming from the ground. Sarah moved to the nearest window and looked out into the darkness. The rain was falling so heavily that visibility was limited to the parking lot and the immediate area around the hospital. But she could see that something had changed in the past hour. The water in the parking lot was deeper now, reaching the door handles of the cars, and it was moving, not just pooling, but flowing with a current that suggested it was connected to a much larger body of water. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert, then another, then a third in rapid succession. Sarah's heart began to race as she read the messages. Flash flood warning for Millfield and surrounding areas. Clearwater River flood barriers compromised. Immediate evacuation recommended for flood zones 1 through 4. Seek higher ground immediately. St. Mary's Hospital was located in Zone 2. The rumbling sound was much closer now, and through the rain she could see the source. A wall of water, carrying debris and moving with terrifying speed, was rushing down what had been Main Street just minutes earlier. The flood barriers hadn't just been compromised, they had failed completely. Sarah ran back to Mrs. Chen's room, where the elderly woman was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with the kind of alertness that comes from recognizing immediate danger. "What's happening?" Mrs. Chen asked, though her tone suggested she already understood more than she was letting on. Before Sarah could answer, the hospital's emergency lighting system activated, bathing the hallways in an eerie red glow as the main power grid shut down automatically. Emergency generators hummed to life in the basement, maintaining power to essential systems, but Sarah knew that the backup power would only run critical equipment.
The impact of the flood against St. Mary's Hospital was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her 8 years working there. The building didn't just shake, it groaned, a deep structural sound that spoke of materials being tested beyond their designed limits.
Through the window, she could see the parking lot transforming from a shallow lake into a raging river, carrying cars, trees, and debris from throughout the town. Mrs. Chen gripped the rails of her hospital bed, her knuckles white with tension. Despite her medical condition, there was a sharpness in her eyes that Sarah hadn't seen before, as if the crisis had burned away the fog of illness and medication that had clouded her thoughts for weeks. Mrs. Chen said, her voice steadier than it had been in days, "Sarah, you need to understand something about this building. The emergency procedures you've been trained for, they assume the structure itself is stable." Sarah paused in her preparations, struck by something in Mrs. Chen's tone. "What do you mean?" "I mean that this hospital was built 43 years ago when flood mitigation wasn't the priority it is today. The foundation wasn't designed to withstand this kind of hydraulic pressure." Before Sarah could ask how Mrs. Chen knew so much about the hospital's construction, Jake's voice came over the intercom again, more urgent than before. "All staff, be advised that the basement level is flooding rapidly. Emergency generators are still operational, but we may lose power to non-essential systems. Repeat, begin evacuation of all ambulatory patients immediately." Sarah looked at Mrs. Chen, whose complex medical equipment required constant power to function. The cardiac monitors, the IV pumps, the oxygen delivery system, all of it depended on electricity to keep her alive. The elderly woman seemed to understand Sarah's thoughts without words being spoken. "You should go," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "Help the patients who can be moved easily. Don't worry about me." "I'm not leaving you," Sarah replied firmly. "We'll figure this out together." Through the hallway windows, Sarah could see other nurses and orderlies working frantically to help mobile patients toward the stairwells. The elevator was automatically shut down during emergency power situations, which meant that anyone who couldn't walk would need to be carried down 2 flights of stairs. For patients like Mrs. Chen, who were connected to life support equipment, such a move could be fatal. Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of stress and fatigue. At 58, Dr. Williams had been working at St. Mary's longer than anyone else on the night staff, and Sarah had never seen him look as shaken as he did at that moment. "Sarah, what's the status of your critical patients?" "Mrs. Chen can't be moved safely without significant risk. Her cardiac condition requires constant monitoring, and disconnecting her from the machines could trigger arrhythmias or worse." Dr. Williams nodded grimly. "We have 3 other patients in similar situations. Mr. Patterson's recovery from surgery makes him too unstable to transport. Miss Williams is in diabetic crisis, and Margaret Foster can't survive without the ventilator." The building shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the windows, Sarah could see that the water level was continuing to rise, now reaching the first-floor windows of the hospital. What had been a parking lot an hour ago was now a lake dotted with the roofs of submerged cars. "Doctor," Sarah said, "how long can we maintain power with the generators?" "In normal circumstances, we have fuel for about 24 hours of essential systems operation. But if the basement floods—" You didn't need to finish the sentence. "If water reaches the generators, they would lose all power, and then patients on life support would have minutes, not hours." Jake's voice crackled over the radio that Dr. Williams carried. "Dr. Williams, I'm in the basement now, and we have a serious problem. The water's rising faster than the drainage systems can handle. It's already up to my chest, and I can see that it's going to reach the generator room in the next hour." Dr. Williams pressed the talk button on his radio. "Jake, you need to get out of there immediately. It's too dangerous." "Negative." Jake's response came back with a determination that surprised both Sarah and Dr. Williams. "I know these systems. I spent time studying the building's infrastructure when I started this job. I think I can reroute some of the electrical connections to buy us more time, but I need to work fast." Sarah realized that Jake Rodriguez, the nervous security guard who had been asking about weather reports just a few hours ago, was volunteering to risk his life in a flooded basement to keep our patients alive. The transformation was remarkable and terrifying. Mrs. Chen had been listening to this conversation with growing concern. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice carrying a new authority, "may I see the building schematics?" Dr. Williams looks confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "The architectural plans for this hospital. You must have them somewhere for emergency planning purposes." "We do, but I don't understand why." "Because," Mrs. Chen interrupted, struggling to sit up straighter in her bed, "I think I can help. I know more about this building's systems than you might expect." Sarah exchanged glances with Dr. Williams. Mrs. Chen's medical chart listed her as a retired engineer, but the specificity of her request suggested a deeper knowledge of the hospital's infrastructure. Dr. Williams made a quick decision.
Sarah, there's a set of emergency building plans in the nursing station. Can you get them? Sarah retrieved the plans, which consisted of several large sheets showing the hospital's layout, electrical systems, and structural elements. As she spread them across Mrs. Chen's bed table, the elderly woman's eyes immediately focused on specific details, with the kind of recognition that comes from intimate familiarity. "I was afraid of this," Mrs. Chen murmured, tracing a finger along the basement-level drawings. "The generator room is positioned in the lowest part of the foundation, and the drainage system wasn't designed to handle this volume of water." Dr. William stared at Mrs. Chen. "How do you know so much about our building systems?" Mrs. Chen met her gaze steadily. "Because I helped design them. I was the chief structural engineer for Morrison Construction Company. We built St. Mary's Hospital between 1980 and 1982. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Mrs. Chen wasn't just a patient who happened to know about engineering. She was one of the people responsible for designing the very building that was now threatening to become their tomb. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah said slowly, "if you designed this building, then you know if it can survive this flood." Mrs. Chen's expression grew somber. "The structure was built to withstand normal flooding, but this," she gestured toward the windows where water was now visible at the level of the first floor, "this is beyond anything we planned for. The foundation can handle some water intrusion, but if the basement floods completely, the building's stability could be compromised." Jake's voice came over the radio again. "I've reached the generator room. The water is almost to the electrical panels, but I think I can jury-rig some connections to keep the essential systems running even if the main generators get flooded." Mrs. Chen grabbed Dr. Williams' radio. "Jake, this is Mrs. Chen in room 237. I need you to listen to me very carefully." "Yes, ma'am?" "The generator room has 3 main electrical panels. The one you want is the middle panel, marked Essential Systems Only. But before you start working on any electrical connections, you need to check the structural supports around you. Look for any signs that the concrete walls or support beams are cracking under pressure." There was a pause as Jake assessed his surroundings. "I can see some hairline cracks in the wall near the main electrical panel, and the floor feels unstable, like it's vibrating." Mrs. Chen closed his eyes, and Sarah could see her mentally reviewing structural calculations she had made over 40 years ago. "Jake, the vibrations mean the foundation is shifting. You may have very limited time before the basement becomes unsafe." "How limited?" "If the foundation starts to settle unevenly, the building could begin to collapse from the bottom up. We could be talking about minutes, not hours." Sarah felt her heart stop. They weren't just racing against the rising water, they were racing against the structural integrity of the building itself. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Williams said urgently, "if you designed this building, you must know if there's a way to stabilize it during a flood."
Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, her face reflecting the weight of knowledge she had hoped never to use. "There might be a way," she said finally, "but it would require someone with engineering knowledge to guide the process, and someone willing to risk their life in the basement to implement it." Jake's voice came over the radio. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Just tell me what needs to be done." Mrs. Chen looked at Sarah with eyes that held 40 years of professional experience and personal responsibility. "The building has emergency support systems that were installed during construction, hydraulic jacks designed to maintain structural integrity during seismic events. They've never been activated, but in theory they could be used to stabilize the foundation during a flood." "Where are these jacks?" Jake asked. "Storage room B7, in the sub-basement level." "But Jake," Mrs. Chen's voice carried a warning that made everyone in the room tense, "that storage room will be completely underwater by now. Accessing the hydraulic jacks would require diving in contaminated floodwater with zero visibility." Sarah realized that Mrs. Chen was asking Jake to risk drowning in order to save the building. But even as the enormity of the request sunk in, she heard Jake's response over the radio. "Tell me exactly where to find these jacks and how to use them." Mrs. Chen began providing detailed instructions, her voice steady despite the tears that were now flowing down her cheeks. As she spoke, Sarah understood that the elderly woman wasn't just remembering technical specifications.
she was confronting the possibility that a building she had helped create might become a death trap for people she had grown to care about. The water outside was still rising, and through the walls of the hospital they could hear the groaning sounds of a structure under siege. Jake was somewhere in the flooded basement, following 40-year-old instructions to activate systems that had never been tested in real-world conditions. And in room 237, Sarah Martinez realized that her quiet night shift had become something she had never imagined possible, a battle to save lives in a building that was slowly being destroyed by the very forces of nature it had been designed to withstand. As Jake disappeared into the flooded sub-basement, Mrs. Chen revealed the second part of her 40-year-old secret. The emergency support systems she had just described didn't exist. She had lied to give Jake hope. But there was something else hidden beneath the hospital that could save them all, if they were willing to pay the price.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed Mrs. Chen's confession was more terrifying than any sound Sarah had heard that night. The elderly woman lay back against her pillows, tears streaming down her face, while her words echoed in the room. "I'm sorry, the emergency support systems, they don't exist. I designed them, but the city council cut them from the budget during the final planning phase." Dr. Williams stared at Mrs. Chen in shock. "You mean you just sent Jake into a flooded basement to look for equipment that isn't there?" "I couldn't let him give up hope," Mrs. Chen whispered. "But there's something else, something I never told anyone about this building, because I was afraid of what people would think." Sarah grabbed the radio, trying to reach Jake before he wasted precious time and energy searching for non-existent hydraulic jacks. "Jake, come in! Jake, respond!" Static crackled back at them. Either Jake couldn't hear them over the sound of rushing water, or something had happened to his radio equipment. Mrs. Chen struggled to sit up, her heart monitor beeping frantically as her pulse rate spiked. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "When we built this hospital, we discovered something during the excavation that the city wanted to keep secret." "What kind of something?" Dr. Williams demanded. "The site had been used for industrial purposes in the 1950s and 60s. There were underground storage facilities, concrete bunkers that had been used to store medical supplies during the Cold War. The city ordered us to build around them rather than remove them, because removal would have been expensive and would have revealed their existence." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the flood. "What does this have to do with saving Jake?" "Those bunkers are still down there, beneath the sub-basement level. They're waterproof, reinforced, and they have their own ventilation systems. If Jake can find them, he could survive even if the building collapses," Dr. Williams finished. Mrs. Chen nodded. "But there's more. The bunkers were connected to the hospital's foundation during construction. If someone could access the bunkers and activate their support systems, they could actually stabilize the building from underneath." Sarah stared at the building plans spread across Mrs. Chen's bed table. "Why didn't you mention these bunkers before?" "Because they weren't supposed to exist. Officially, they were never there. The city wanted plausible deniability in case anyone ever asked questions about Cold War preparations. My construction company was paid a significant bonus to keep quiet about what we found during excavation." Dr. Williams grabbed his radio. "Jake, if you can hear this, stop looking for hydraulic jacks. We have new information." Still no response. Mrs. Chen closed her eyes, accessing memories she had buried for over 40 years. "The entrance to the bunker system is through a maintenance hatch in storage room B7. It's disguised to look like a floor drain, but it's actually an access point to a ladder that leads down to the bunker level." "How deep?" 20 feet below the sub-basement level. Jake would have to dive down through the flooded storage room, find the hatch, and then swim down through a vertical tunnel to reach the bunkers. Sarah realized the full implications of what Mrs. Chen was describing. Jake would have to hold his breath for what could be minutes, while navigating underwater through spaces he had never seen, following directions based on 40-year-old memories, with no guarantee that the bunkers were still intact or that their support systems would function. But even as Sarah processed the impossibility of the task, she heard a crackling sound over the radio.
Jake's voice came through, weak and distorted. "This is Jake. I'm in storage room B7, and I can't find any hydraulic jacks. The whole room is flooded, and I can barely see anything." Sarah grabbed the radio. "Jake, listen carefully. Mrs. Chen has new information. There are underground bunkers beneath your current location." "Bunkers?" Mrs. Chen took the radio from Sarah's hands. "Jake, this is Eleanor. I need you to look for what appears to be a large floor drain near the center of the storage room. It should be about 3 feet in diameter with a metal grate covering it." There was a long pause. "I think I see something like that, but it's completely underwater. The grate looks different from a normal drain, though, more substantial." "That's the entrance to the bunker system." "Jake, I have to be honest with you about what I'm asking. You would need to dive down through that entrance, swim through a vertical tunnel, and hope that the bunkers are still dry and functional." Another pause. "How long can I hold my breath?" "The tunnel is about 20 feet long, straight down. If you're a strong swimmer, you should be able to make it in under a minute." Sarah interrupted. "Jake, you don't have to do this." But Jake's response came back with the determination of someone who had already made his decision. "Jake, if I can reach these bunkers, will I be able to save the building? The bunkers have emergency power systems and structural support controls that were designed to stabilize the entire building complex. If they're still functional after 40 years, then yes, you could save everyone." Sarah could hear Jake moving through the water, and she imagined him preparing for what might be the most dangerous dive of his life. But there was something else, a quality in his voice that suggested this wasn't the first time he had faced a life-and-death decision in dangerous circumstances. "Before I do this," Jake said, "I need to tell you both something. I'm not just a security guard. I was an Army medic for 6 years, including 2 deployments in Afghanistan. I left the service after..." He paused. "After a training accident that killed 2 of my fellow soldiers. I've been running from responsibility ever since, taking jobs where life and death decisions weren't part of the daily routine." Sarah felt her heart break for Jake, understanding now why he had seemed so cautious, so hypervigilant during his first months at the hospital. "Jake," she said into the radio, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone." "Yes, I do. I have to prove it to myself." His voice was steady now, filled with the resolve of someone who had found his purpose. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to trust your 40-year-old memories and dive for those bunkers." Mrs. Chen was crying openly now. "Jake, please be careful. I've already made too many mistakes with this building. I can't have your death on my conscience." "You won't, because I'm coming back." The radio went silent. Sarah, Dr. Williams, and Mrs. Chen waited in tense silence, listening to the sounds of the building under siege. The water outside was now reaching the second-floor windows, and the structure was making sounds that spoke of materials being pushed beyond their limits. Minutes ticked like hours. Sarah found herself holding her breath as if she could somehow share Jake's burden by experiencing a fraction of what he was enduring in the flooded basement. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm in the bunkers, Mrs. Chen. These places are incredible. They're completely dry with their own air circulation systems, and there are control panels everywhere." The relief in the room was palpable. "Jake," Mrs. Chen said, "can you see a main control panel with switches labeled Foundation Stabilization?" "I see it. It looks like something from a science fiction movie. There are dozens of switches and gauges and some kind of monitoring system that shows the building's structural status." Mrs. Chen was studying the building plans with renewed focus. The system was designed to respond to seismic activity, but the same principles should work for flood-related foundation problems. "Jake, I need you to look for a switch labeled Emergency Foundation Support." "Found it. But there's a warning label that says something about irreversible activation and structural modification." Mrs. Chen hesitated. "Jake, activating that system will permanently alter the building's foundation. It will save the structure during the flood, but it will also mean that the hospital will need to be completely rebuilt afterward." Dr. Williams grabbed his radio. "Jake, we have patients who will die if this building collapses. Do whatever you have to do." "Understood. Activating emergency foundation support now." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah felt the building's vibrations change from chaotic shaking to a more stable, rhythmic pattern. The groaning sounds diminished, and the water outside seemed less threatening, as if the hospital had suddenly found its footing against the flood. But even as Sarah felt relief washing over her, Mrs. Chen's expression remained troubled. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Chen pointed to a section of the building plans. "The bunker system has its own life support capabilities, but it was never designed for long-term occupation. Jake might be safe from the flood down there, but if the bunkers seal automatically during the emergency protocols, he could be trapped."
Sarah grabbed the radio. "Jake, is there any indication that the bunkers might lock down or seal themselves?" Jake's response was interrupted by a new sound, a low humming that seemed to come from deep within the building itself. "I think this system is activating some kind of protective protocols. I can see blast doors starting to close and the air circulation is changing to internal recycling mode." "Jake, you need to get out of there immediately," Dr. Williams ordered. "I can't. The blast doors are already sealed, and the tunnel I used to get down here is now blocked by an automatic barrier system." Sarah realized that Jake had saved the hospital and everyone in it, but at the cost of his own freedom. He was now trapped in a Cold War bunker that had been designed to protect against nuclear attacks, not to allow easy escape. "Jake," Mrs. Chen said into the radio, her voice shaking with guilt and desperation, "there should be an emergency override system for the blast doors. Look for a red panel marked Manual Exit Control." "I see it, but it requires some kind of authorization code." Mrs. Chen closed her eyes, accessing memories that were over 40 years old. The code was based on the building's construction date. "Try 1982. A pause, then Jake's voice. "That's not working." "Try 03151982. That was the full date when we completed the bunker installation." Another pause. Still nothing. Sarah could see Mrs. Chen's mind racing, trying to recall details from a project she'd helped complete when she was only 25 years old. The elderly woman was fighting against both time and the fog of decades, searching for information that might save Jake's life. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah said gently, "what else do you remember about these bunkers? There has to be another way out." The bunkers were designed with multiple exit points in case the primary entrance was compromised. But I can't remember exactly where they were positioned. The city insisted that the plans be kept classified, and I haven't seen them since 1982. Dr. Williams had been monitoring the hospital's other patients while Sarah and Mrs. Chen focused on Jake's situation. Now, he returned with news that complicated their crisis further. "We have a problem. The flood has damaged the hospital's communication systems. We can't reach emergency services, and they can't coordinate a rescue operation if they don't know what's happening inside the building." Sarah realized they were facing a cascade of problems. Jake was trapped in underground bunkers that might have limited life support. The hospital was structurally stable for now, but they were cut off from outside help. And they still had 4 patients on life support who couldn't be evacuated safely. Mrs. Chen struggled to sit up, her heart monitor beeping frantically. "Sarah, help me get to those building plans. I need to study them more carefully." "Mrs. Chen, you need to rest. Your heart can't handle the stress." "My heart has been carrying the weight of this building's secrets for over 40 years. It can handle a few more hours if it means saving Jake." As Mrs. Chen pored over the building schematics, Sarah realized that the elderly woman was displaying a level of mental acuity that hadn't been present during her weeks of recovery from cardiac problems. The crisis had somehow sharpened her focus, burning away the haze of medication and illness that had clouded her thoughts. "There," Mrs. Chen said suddenly, pointing to a section of the plans. The bunkers were connected to the hospital's main foundation through a series of utility tunnels. If Jake can find the right tunnel, he should be able to access the hospital's basement again. Sarah grabbed the radio. "Jake, Mrs. Chen thinks there might be utility tunnels that connect the bunkers to the main basement level. Can you see any doorways or passages besides the one you came through?" Jake's response came back after a few minutes of searching. "I found something. There's a door marked Utility Access Building Systems Only.
It's locked, but I think I can force it open. Be careful, Mrs. Chen warned. Those tunnels might be flooded too, and they weren't designed with safety features like the bunkers. I'll be careful, but I need to try. The air circulation system down here is showing some concerning readings. I think the bunker's life support was designed for short-term use, not for someone to live in them. Sarah felt her anxiety spike as she realized that Jake was facing multiple threats. The possibility of drowning in flooded utility tunnels, the risk of becoming lost in underground passages he'd never seen, and the growing danger that the bunkers themselves might not be able to sustain human life for much longer. Jake, Sarah said into the radio, before you try to leave the bunkers, tell us what you can see about the building's structural status. Are we stable up here? Jake's response came back after a few minutes of searching. The monitoring systems show that the emergency foundation support is working. The building should be able to withstand the flood for the duration of the storm. But Jake paused, and he could hear concern in his voice. The system is drawing a lot of power from the bunker's emergency generators. If those generators fail, you could lose both the foundation support and the hospital's life support systems. Dr. Williams grabbed the radio. How long do the generators have fuel? According to the gauges, maybe 4 to 6 hours at current consumption levels. Sarah did quick mental calculations. It was now nearly 3 a.m. If the storm continued for several more hours, which the weather report suggested it would, they might lose power before dawn. And if they lost power, Mrs. Chen and the other critical patients would be in immediate danger. Jake, Mrs. Chen said, you need to know that there's a manual override for the foundation support system. If the generators fail, someone in the bunkers could switch to backup power, but it would require constant monitoring and adjustment. You're saying someone needs to stay down here? I'm saying that if you leave the bunkers and the generators fail, we all die. But if you stay, you might be able to keep us alive until rescue services can reach us. Sarah realized that Mrs. Chen was asking Jake to choose between his own safety and the lives of everyone in the hospital. It was the kind of impossible decision that she knew would haunt him regardless of what he chose. But Jake's response came back without hesitation. Then I'll stay. You just need to help me understand how to operate these systems. Mrs. Chen wiped away tears as she began explaining the technical details of equipment she'd helped design before Jake was born. And as she spoke, Sarah marveled at the woman's ability to recall complex engineering specifications from decades ago, drawing on knowledge that had been dormant for 40 years. The building around them had settled into a more stable rhythm. The water outside was still rising, but more slowly now, and the structural supports that Jake had activated were holding firm against the hydraulic pressure. For the first time since the flood began, Sarah allowed herself to hope that they might actually survive the night. But even as she felt this hope, she also understood that their survival depended entirely on Jake Rodriguez, a man that she'd known for only 3 months, who was now trapped in underground bunkers operating equipment he'd never seen before, based on instructions from a woman whose memory was their only guide to systems that had been classified secrets for over 4 decades. As Jake worked to master the bunker's systems, Mrs. Chen revealed the final and most devastating secret about St. Mary's Hospital. The underground bunkers weren't just storage facilities, they were part of a classified Cold War medical experiment, and the hospital had been built as a front to study the long-term effects of low-level radiation exposure on unwitting patients.
The confession came in a whisper that was barely audible over the sound of rain against the windows and the steady hum of the hospital's struggling electrical systems. Mrs. Chen's voice was so quiet that Sarah had to lean close to hear her words. The bunkers weren't just storage facilities. They were research laboratories. Dr. Williams, who had been monitoring the other patients' conditions, turned sharply toward Mrs. Chen's bed. What kind of research? Mrs. Chen closed her eyes, and Sarah could see the weight of decades-old secrets pressing down on the elderly woman like a physical burden. In the 1960s, the government was conducting studies on the medical effects of radiation exposure. Not just high-level exposure from nuclear weapons, but low-level, long-term exposure that might occur in various scenarios during the Cold War. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Are you saying the hospital was built as part of a medical experiment? The hospital was real, the medical care was real, but there were additional purposes. Mrs. Chen's voice was growing stronger, as if the act of finally telling the truth was giving her energy she hadn't possessed in weeks. The bunkers contained equipment for monitoring radiation levels throughout the building, and there were systems designed to introduce controlled amounts of radioactive materials into the hospital's air and water supply. Dr. Williams stared at Mrs. Chen in horror. You're telling us that patients were being exposed to radiation without their knowledge or consent? The levels were supposed to be minimal, within safety guidelines. The researchers wanted to study long-term health effects in a population that was already dealing with medical issues so that any health problems could be attributed to existing conditions rather than radiation exposure. Sarah realized the implications immediately. Mrs. Chen, if patients have been exposed to radiation for decades, and if those systems are still active, that's why I need to tell Jake exactly what he's dealing with down in those bunkers. Some of the equipment he's operating doesn't just control the building's foundation. It controls systems that should have been deactivated 40 years ago. Mrs. Chen grabbed the radio with hands that were now steady with purpose. Jake, I need to ask you about the control panels you're seeing. Are there any systems labeled environmental control or atmospheric management? Jake's response came back after a brief pause. Yeah, there's a whole section of controls labeled environmental systems. They show readings for air quality, water quality, and something called background radiation monitoring? Jake, those systems need to be shut down immediately. They control equipment that was installed for research purposes that ended decades ago. What kind of research? Mrs. Chen looked at Sarah and Dr. Williams, seeking some kind of permission or absolution for the words she was about to speak. Medical experimentation involving radiation exposure. Jake, the hospital may have been exposing patients to low-level radiation for research purposes since it opened. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah found herself thinking about all the patients she had cared for 8 years at St. Mary's, wondering if their medical conditions had been complicated by exposure they never knew they were receiving. Jake's voice came back over the radio, tight with controlled anger. Are you telling me that this hospital has been poisoning people for 40 years? The levels were supposed to be minimal, within government safety guidelines, but I don't know if those systems were ever properly deactivated, and I don't know what 40 years of operation might have done to safety protocols. Dr. Williams grabbed the radio. Jake, can you see any indication of whether these environmental systems are currently active? The monitoring panels show activity in multiple building systems, air circulation, water treatment, and Jesus Christ. There are radiation detectors throughout the building, and they're all showing readings above normal background levels. Sarah felt the room spin around her. Every patient she had cared for, every night shift she had worked, every breath she had taken in this building, all of it potentially contaminated by an experiment she never knew existed. Mrs. Chen, how long have you known about this? I've known since the construction phase. The engineering company I worked for was contracted by a subsidiary of the Department of Defense. We were told the research was essential for national security and that the health risks were minimal, but I was young and I needed the job, and I told myself that I was helping to protect the country. Jake's voice came over the radio. I've found the controls for the environmental systems. It looks like I can shut them down from here, but I need to know exactly which systems to deactivate. Mrs. Chen studied the building plans with the focused intensity of someone whose life's work had become a matter of life and death. Jake, look for controls labeled atmospheric enhancement and water treatment supplementation. Those are the systems that introduce radioactive materials into the building's environmental systems. Found them. Both systems show as active. According to these readouts, they've been running continuously for, it says 43 years. Sarah felt sick. 43 years of patients, staff, and visitors potentially exposed to radiation without their knowledge.
43 years of medical treatments complicated by contamination that doctors never knew to look for. "Shut them down," Dr. Williams ordered. "Shut down everything that's not essential for keeping us alive." As Jake worked to deactivate the systems, Mrs. Chen continued her confession. There were safeguards. The systems were supposed to be monitored by government researchers with regular safety inspections and automatic shutdowns if radiation levels exceeded acceptable limits. But as far as I know, those researchers stopped coming to the hospital in the late 1980s. "You mean the systems have been running unsupervised for over 30 years?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. After the construction was completed, I never had access to the bunkers again. I assumed the government was maintaining oversight, but I never asked questions because I was afraid of the answers." Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "I've deactivated the atmospheric and water treatment systems, but you need to know that shutting them down has triggered some kind of alert protocol. Alarm lights are flashing, and there's an automated message saying that unauthorized system modifications have been detected." Mrs. Chen went pale. "Jake, the bunkers may have automatic security protocols that activate when someone tampers with the research systems. You could be in danger." "What kind of danger?"
The bunkers were designed to prevent unauthorized access to classified research. If the security systems think you're an intruder trying to sabotage the experiments— Jake's transmission was cut off by a sound that chilled everyone in the room. The sound of heavy metal doors slamming shut transmitted through the radio before the connection went dead. "Jake!" Sarah called into the radio. "Jake, respond!" Silence. Dr. Williams grabbed his radio and switched to the emergency frequency, trying to reach outside rescue services, but all he got was static. The flood had apparently damaged more of the hospital's communication equipment than they had realized. Mrs. Chen was struggling to breathe, her heart monitor showing dangerous irregularities as the stress of the situation pushed her cardiac condition beyond safe limits. "This is my fault," she gasped. "All of it. The radiation exposure, Jake being trapped, the patients at risk. I should have spoken up 40 years ago." Sarah forced herself to focus on immediate medical concerns while processing the larger horror of what they had learned. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to calm down. Your heart can't handle this level of stress." "How can I calm down? I've just told you that I helped build a hospital that's been slowly poisoning people for 40 years, and now the man who tried to save us is trapped because of security systems I helped design." Dr. Williams was checking on the other critical patients, confirming that the life support systems were still functioning despite the shutdown of the environmental contamination systems. "Sarah, we need to focus on what we can control. Jake found a way to stabilize the building's foundation, and he shut down the radiation exposure systems. We have to trust that he can find a way out of the bunkers." But even as Dr. Williams spoke, Sarah realized that their situation had become exponentially more complex. They weren't just dealing with a flood anymore. They were dealing with the aftermath of a decades-long medical experiment that had potentially harmed thousands of people. And Jake, the man who had discovered and shut down these systems, was now trapped in the very bunkers where the research had been conducted. Mrs. Chen was studying the building plans with desperate intensity, searching for something she might have missed during the original construction. There has to be another way out of the bunkers. The government wouldn't have built a research facility with only one exit point. What about emergency protocols? If the bunkers were designed for long-term research, they must have had safety procedures for emergencies. Emergency protocols. Mrs. Chen's eyes widened with sudden realization. "Sarah, get me that radio. I think I know how to help Jake." As Sarah handed over the radio, she could only hope that Mrs. Chen's 40-year-old memories contained one more secret that might save the man who had already risked everything to save them all. "Jake," Mrs. Chen called into the radio, "if you can hear me, look for an emergency communication system. It should be a red phone or intercom marked Emergency Command." For long moments, there was only static. Then, faintly, Jake's voice came through a different frequency. "I can hear you, but barely. I'm in some kind of security lockdown. The blast doors are sealed, and the air circulation is changed to what the system calls containment mode." "Jake, listen carefully. The containment mode is designed to prevent contamination from leaving the research area, but it also has protocols for researchers' safety. Look for a panel marked Emergency Researcher Extraction."
Sarah held her breath as she waited for Jake's response, knowing that Mrs. Chen was drawing on memories from an era when she had helped create systems designed to protect people conducting classified experiments that had been harming patients for decades without their knowledge. The irony was not lost on her. The same systems designed to protect government researchers might now be the only thing that could save the man who had shut down their harmful experiments. As Jake worked to escape the bunkers using emergency protocols designed to protect Cold War researchers, the flood outside began to recede. But the building's radiation detectors started showing dangerous spikes throughout the hospital, suggesting that shutting down the contamination systems had triggered a massive release of accumulated radioactive materials into the building's atmosphere. The radiation alarms began screaming at 4:17 a.m., piercing through the sound of rain and floodwater with a mechanical urgency that made Sarah's blood run cold. Red warning lights that she had never seen before flickered to life throughout the ICU, and automated voices began announcing, "Radiation hazard detected. Initiate contamination protocols. All personnel report to decontamination stations." Mrs. Chen's face went ashen as she listened to the alarms. Jake shutting down the environmental systems must have caused a massive release of accumulated radioactive materials. 40 years of contamination that was being slowly released is now being dumped into the building's atmosphere all at once. Dr. Williams was already moving, checking radiation detection equipment that Sarah hadn't even known the hospital possessed. "The readings are off the charts," he called out. "We're looking at radiation levels that are hundreds of times higher than normal background." Sarah felt panic rising in her chest as she realized the implications. What does this mean for the patients? For us? "It means," Mrs. Chen said quietly, "that everyone in this building is now receiving radiation doses that could be lethal within hours, not years." Jake's voice crackled over the emergency communication system. "I can see the radiation readings from down here. The monitors in the bunkers are showing dangerous levels throughout the entire hospital. But I think I found the emergency researcher extraction system." Mrs. Chen grabbed the radio. "Jake, the extraction system was designed to get researchers out safely during exactly this kind of contamination event. But you need to activate it quickly because the longer you wait, the more dangerous it becomes to navigate the building." "What about everyone else? The patients who can't be moved?" Sarah realized that Jake was asking whether he should save himself or try to find a way to help them from inside the contaminated building. The fact that he was even considering staying to help others, after everything he had already endured, filled her with both admiration and desperation. "Jake," she said into the radio, "we need you to get out safely so you can guide emergency services to us. You can't help us if you're dead." But even as Sarah spoke, she could see Dr. Williams working frantically to assess their options. "The radiation levels are climbing rapidly. At this rate, we have maybe 30 minutes before exposure becomes critically dangerous for the patients." Mrs. Chen was studying monitoring equipment that was displaying information Sarah had never seen before. "The contamination isn't uniform throughout the building. The ICU has lower radiation levels than other areas, probably because it's on the second floor and farther from the source." "What's the source?" "The research systems were designed to introduce radioactive materials into the building's air and water supply through the basement-level ventilation systems. When Jake shut them down, 40 years of accumulated contamination was released all at once instead of being gradually dispersed." Jake's voice came over the radio. "I've activated the emergency extraction system. There's some kind of sealed transport pod that's supposed to carry researchers from the bunkers to a safe exit point outside the building, but the system is asking for authorization codes." Mrs. Chen closed her eyes, accessing memories from construction meetings that had taken place before Jake was born. The authorization code was based on the project designation, try Nightingale 1962. A pause, then Jake's response. "That worked. The transport system is activating, but it's showing a delay of 15 minutes for a decontamination cycling before I can use it." Sarah realized that Jake would be trapped in the bunkers for another 15 minutes while radiation levels continued to climb throughout the hospital. And even if he successfully escaped, it would take time for him to guide emergency services to them, time they might not have. "Dr. Williams," she said, "what can we do to protect the patients while we wait for help?" Dr. Williams was consulting emergency protocols that Sarah had never seen implemented.
There are radiation exposure treatments we can administer, potassium iodide to protect thyroid function, and chelation agents to help the body eliminate radioactive materials. But we need to start treatments immediately, and we don't have enough supplies for everyone. Mrs. Chen struggled to sit up, her heart monitor beeping frantically as she fought against her medical condition and the growing radiation exposure. There might be medical supplies in the bunkers. The research facility would have needed extensive medical support for monitoring the researchers' health. Jake's voice came over the radio. I can see the medical storage areas down here, but I'm locked into the extraction pod preparation area. I can't access other parts of the bunkers without risking the contamination cycling that's supposed to protect me during transport. Sarah realized they were facing an impossible choice. Jake could follow the safety protocols and escape cleanly, or he could risk contamination to gather the medical supplies that might save them. Jake, she said firmly into the radio, follow the safety protocols. Get out of there and get help. We'll find another way to protect the patients. But Mrs. Chen interrupted. Sarah, there is no other way. The radiation levels are climbing too fast. Without proper medical treatment, everyone in this building will be dead within hours. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical presence. Sarah looked at Mrs. Chen, whose machines were keeping her alive, at the other patients throughout the ICU who were unconscious and vulnerable, and at Dr. Williams, who was calculating radiation exposure rates with the grim efficiency of someone who understood they were all facing death. There has to be something we can do, Sarah said, but even as she spoke, she could see the radiation readings continuing to climb on the monitors. Jake's voice came over the radio. The extraction pod is almost ready, but I've been thinking, if I leave now, you're all going to die before emergency services can organize a radiation response team. But if I can access the medical supplies in the bunkers. Jake, no, Sarah said into the radio. You've already done enough. You've saved the building's foundation, you've shut down the contamination systems, and you've given us a chance. Don't throw your life away. I'm not throwing my life away. I'm finally using it for something that matters. Mrs. Chen took the radio from Sarah's hands. Jake, listen to me. I'm 87 years old. I've been carrying the guilt of this building's secrets for over 40 years. If there's medical equipment in those bunkers that can save lives, then I want you to get it. Not because I'm ordering you to, but because I'm asking you to help me make amends for what I helped create. Sarah could hear Jake moving around in the bunkers, and she realized he was making the same kind of impossible choice she had faced when she decided to stay with Mrs. Chen instead of evacuating with the other staff. The choice to risk your own life to save others, even when the odds were terrible and the outcome uncertain. I've found the medical storage area. It's extensive. They have enough radiation treatment supplies for dozens of people, plus protective equipment and decontamination materials. But accessing it means I'll be exposed to contamination, and I won't be able to use the clean extraction pod. Dr. Williams grabbed the radio. Jake, what kind of protective equipment are you seeing? Full radiation suits, breathing apparatus, radiation detection equipment. It looks like the researchers were prepared for major contamination events. Can you put on protective equipment before accessing the medical supplies? A pause as Jake assessed his options. Yes, but once I put on contaminated protective gear, I can't leave the bunkers through the clean extraction system. I'd have to find another way out. Mrs. Chen was studying the building plans with desperate intensity. Jake, there should be a contaminated materials exit system. Look for signs pointing to hazmat disposal or contaminated equipment removal. I see it. There's a whole separate exit tunnel marked for contaminated materials disposal. It looks like it leads to a different part of the building's exterior. Sarah realized that Jake was proposing to gather the medical supplies they needed to survive radiation exposure, but at the cost of contaminating himself and having to escape through systems designed for hazardous waste disposal. He would be risking his life not just to save them, but to give them a chance at surviving long enough to expose the truth about what had been done to thousands of patients over 40 years. Jake was proposing to gather the medical supplies they needed to survive radiation exposure, but at the cost of contaminating himself and having to escape through systems designed for hazardous waste disposal. He would be risking his life not just to save them, but to give them a chance at surviving long enough to expose the truth about what had been done to thousands of patients over 40 years.
As Jake prepared to risk everything to gather life-saving medical supplies, the flood outside suddenly began to recede rapidly, but the drainage revealed something that changed everything. The hospital's foundation wasn't just contaminated with radioactive materials. It had been slowly leaking into Millfield's groundwater supply for 40 years, meaning the entire town's population had been unknowingly exposed to radiation. And Jake's actions might have just accelerated a contamination crisis that would affect thousands of people.
The realization came not from monitoring equipment or engineering calculations, but from the simple act of looking out the window as the first pale light of dawn began to penetrate the storm clouds. Sarah was checking on Mrs. Chen's condition when she noticed that the water level in the parking lot was dropping with unnatural speed, leaving behind a landscape that looked like something from another planet. Where cars had been submerged just hours earlier, there were now twisted metal sculptures coated with a substance that seemed to glow with its own faint, sickly light. The pavement itself appeared to be steaming, and as the floodwater receded, it was leaving behind patterns of discoloration that spread outward from the hospital like infection radiating from an untreated wound. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah said quietly, "I think you need to see this." The elderly woman struggled to sit up and look toward the window. When she saw the glowing residue left behind by the receding floodwater, her face went completely white, and her heart monitor began beeping frantically. "Oh, God," Mrs. Chen whispered. "The contamination wasn't contained to the building. It's been leaking into the groundwater for decades." Dr. Williams rushed to the window, and Sarah could see his medical training warring with the impossibility of what they were witnessing. "That's not just surface contamination. The entire area around the hospital is showing signs of radioactive saturation." Jake's voice crackled over the radio from the bunkers. "I can see monitoring data down here that confirms what you're seeing. The groundwater contamination readings are off the charts. It looks like the research facility's containment systems failed gradually over the years, and radioactive materials have been seeping into the town's water supply." Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her world as she realized the implications. "How many people drink water from the Millfield municipal system?" "The entire town," Dr. Williams replied grimly. "About 12,000 people, plus everyone in the surrounding agricultural areas." Mrs. Chen was crying now, but they were tears of a different quality than her earlier expressions of guilt. These were tears of someone who had just realized that a mistake made in youth had grown into a disaster of unimaginable proportions. "The cancer rates," she whispered. "I should have noticed the cancer rates." Sarah stared at Mrs. Chen. "What cancer rates?" "Millfield has had higher than normal rates of certain cancers for years. Thyroid cancer, leukemia, lung cancer, all the types associated with radiation exposure. I knew about the statistics because my own family doctor mentioned them, but I told myself it was just a statistical anomaly." Dr. Williams was accessing medical databases on his phone, pulling out public health information that Sarah had never thought to examine. "Mrs. Chen is right. Millfield's cancer incidence is 40% higher than the state average. The data goes back decades." Jake's voice came over the radio with new urgency. "The monitoring equipment down here shows that the contamination release when I shut down the environmental systems has accelerated the groundwater leakage. What was happening gradually over 40 years is now happening in hours." Sarah realized that Jake's heroic efforts to save the hospital had inadvertently triggered a much larger environmental disaster. The contamination that had been slowly seeping into the town's water supply was now flowing out rapidly, carried by the floodwater that was receding toward the Clearwater River and beyond. "Jake," she called into the radio, "can you see any way to stop or contain the groundwater contamination?" "I'm looking at the bunker's environmental controls. There are systems designed to manage groundwater, but they require manual activation and constant monitoring. Someone would have to stay down here to operate them." Mrs. Chen grabbed the radio with hands that were shaking from more than just medical conditions. "Jake, those groundwater management systems were designed to contain contamination during active research periods. If you can activate them, you might be able to stop the accelerated leakage, but what? But operating those systems while wearing protective gear
in a contaminated environment for the hours it would take to stabilize the groundwater, Jake, the radiation exposure would be fatal. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of receding floodwater and the mechanical beeping of medical equipment. Sarah realized that Jake was being asked to choose between allowing thousands of people to be exposed to accelerated radiation contamination or sacrificing his own life to prevent an environmental catastrophe that could affect generations. Dr. Williams had been monitoring radiation levels throughout the hospital, and his readings were showing a gradual improvement as the environmental systems that Jake had shut down continued to purge accumulated contamination from the building's atmosphere. The good news is, Dr. Williams reported, that radiation levels in the hospital are starting to decrease. Jake's actions have stopped the immediate threat to patients and staff. What about the town?
That's a different problem entirely. If contaminated groundwater is flowing into the Clearwater River, it could affect communities downstream for hundreds of miles. Jake's voice came over the radio. I found the groundwater management controls. The system is complex, but I think I can figure it out. The question is whether I should. Mrs. Chen was studying medical monitors that showed not just her own condition, but environmental readings from throughout the hospital. Jake, I need to tell you something about those groundwater management systems. They weren't just designed to contain contamination. They were designed to manage it for research purposes. What do you mean? The researchers needed to be able to control exactly how much contamination reached the town's water supply for their long-term studies. The groundwater management system can contain the contamination, but it can also direct it to specific areas. Sarah felt sick as she realized what Mrs. Chen was describing. You're saying the contamination of the town's water supply wasn't an accident? It was intentional? Not initially, but when the researchers realized that the containment systems were failing, instead of fixing them, they modified them to create a controlled contamination scenario. They turned an accidental leak into a deliberate experiment on the entire population of Millfield. Jake's response came back filled with the kind of cold anger that Sarah had never heard in his voice before. Are you telling me that the government has been deliberately poisoning this entire town for decades? I'm telling you that what started as an accident became an opportunity for researchers who valued their data more than human lives. Dr. Williams was pulling up decades of public health records, correlating them with what they were learning about the hospital's contamination systems. If this is true, then we're not just dealing with a medical emergency. We're dealing with one of the largest human rights violations in American history. Sarah realized that their crisis had evolved far beyond the flood that had started it all. They were now sitting at the center of a conspiracy that had affected thousands of people over multiple decades, and the decisions they made in the next few hours could determine whether that conspiracy remained hidden or was finally exposed to the world. Jake, she called into the radio, whatever you decide to do about the groundwater systems, you need to know that you're not just making a decision about contamination. You're making a decision about whether this experiment finally gets shut down permanently. I understand, but I need to know something from Mrs. Chen. If I activate the groundwater containment systems, will they just prevent further contamination, or will they also preserve evidence of what was done? Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of Jake's question. The monitoring systems in the bunkers have been recording data continuously for over 40 years. If you can preserve that data while containing the contamination, it would provide definitive proof of everything that was done to this community. Then I know what I have to do. Sarah grabbed the radio. Jake, you don't have to sacrifice yourself to expose this conspiracy. There have to be other ways to preserve the evidence and protect the town. Maybe, but Sarah, I've been running from responsibility for 5 years. Tonight, I finally have a chance to do something that matters, something that makes up for the mistakes I made.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.